This episode is called Magic Xylophone, Making Bluey. For this project, I start with an armature wire skeleton and I cover it with some Ultralight Sculpey to create the base of Bluey as a gnome in the Magic Xylophone episode. Once I'm happy with the overall shape, I put it in the oven to bake. Once it's out of the oven, I cover the entire thing in a sheet of super Sculpey clay. Next, I take some oval-shaped pieces of clay and place them right where I think the eyes would go, and I first started way too small, but I eventually get it to the right size. Once I'm happy with the size of the shape of the eyes, I blend them into the base of my clay. Once I finish with her eyes, I take a triangle piece of clay and I place it right at the end of her nose and I blend it in. Moving on to her gnome hat, I take a noodle of clay and I wrap it right around the top of her head just above the eyes and I blend it into the hat portion of the clay. Next, I take a smaller clay noodle and I place it right below the tip of the hat and blend it in where that fold would go. For her eyes, I decided to take some little smaller clay ovals to place on her eyes where her pupils would go. Moving on to her mouth, I take my spoon tool to create the basic shape of how I wanted her facial expression to be, and I took a little noodle of clay to create where her teeth would go, and then I blend it in. I also take the edge of my spoon tool to create a line for the bottom lip. Next, using my Explorer tool, I create some lines on her teeth to create the lines where her teeth are. Now that her face is finished, I take some small strips of clay and I wrap the armature wires where her arms are going to go, and then I blend it into her body. For her little tiny kind of stubby fingers, I take some little balls of clay and I place them right where her thumbs and 3 fingers would go. I then repeat the same process on the other arm. I do the same thing for her legs by covering each of the armature wires in a small sheet of clay and I shape it into the shape of her legs and create a little bit more of a feet shape at the bottom of her legs where her feet would go, and then I create some little lines to separate her toes. Forgetting that she actually has a tail, I had to kind of carve a hole for the armature wire to go into the clay, and then I cover the wire in the clay the same way I did with the arms and legs, and I blend it into her base and make sure that it's firmly secure. Once it is fully covered, I use my little spoon tool to create the little tufts at the end of her tail, and then I put her in the oven for her final bake. Now that she's baked and cooled, I start by painting her hat this nice bright red color. Next, I start by painting pretty much her entire body the medium blue color that covers most of her body, other than her mouth and nose. Next, I start by adding the dark blue right around the sides of her eyes and going all the way around the back of her head to the other side of her eyes. I then used that same dark blue to create two smaller dots on the back of her back and then one slightly larger one right below them. Then I finish up using the dark blue by creating the dark blue end to the tip of her tail. Next, I move on to her tummy by using the lightest blue color that she has. I then use that same light blue to paint her hands and right around her wrist area. And I also paint that same light blue around her feet and right around her ankles. Next, I move on to her teeth and her eyes by painting them a bright white color. For her mouth area, I had to mix a color of tan and yellow to get it as close to that color that she has on her mouth. I then paint her eyes, nose, and the lines of her teeth the color black. For the lines of her teeth, I had to use the finest brush possible to keep the line as thin as I possibly could. For her base, I paint it a bright gray color to kind of emphasize the fact that she's kind of a statue. She's also standing on cement, and I really wanted it to have an outdoorsy, statue-y feel to it. And just as I'm starting to think that it's finished, I realized that I had forgotten the light blue line that goes right around the edges of her mouth. Once I get that finished, I think she's ready for the Glamour Shots. And there you have it, Bluey Gnome from the Magic Xylophone episode. If you enjoyed watching me make Bluey as a gnome, stay tuned for next week when I make Bingo with the Dinger and the Magic Xylophone. Anyways, thanks for watching, have a great day, and remember to stay crafty.